Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's Wednesday, the 10th of January 2018. And it's a rather damp and somewhat dank morning here at Misson Springs, just north of the village of Misson, at the Misson Springs Protection Camp. And I'm sitting in my car in the entrance of the field to the camp. It's just miserable out there. Anyway, it's miserable in the country, really, after Theresa May's reshuffle or non-reshuffle, depending on where you sit. Of course, as far as Greg Clark's concerned, it was a non-reshuffle. He was desperate to get out of the job, but finds himself still in it. Elsewhere, I mean, so much I could say, but I mean, we'll keep it primarily to fracking. But a couple of observations. I mean, Jeremy Hunt digging his heels in, which was, of course, reportedly what Greg Clark had done. But it was Jeremy Hunt who Theresa May wanted to put into the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. That was her second choice, of course, after Boris. But Boris made it very clear that he was not about to be levered out of the Foreign Office, and apparently threatened massive devastation if he was forced to go into the backbenches. Jeremy Hunt, pretty much the same, insisted on staying in charge of the NHS as health minister. And reportedly, the primary reason he wanted to stay there was to finish the job. Well, what is that job? That job is, of course, the devastation of the NHS. And although the lamestream media tries to paint anybody that has the audacity to suggest that the NHS is being deliberately destroyed as just a rampant conspiracy theorist, the facts speak for themselves. It has been systematically privatised. Funding has been dramatically reduced. Direct funding. Much of the funding now is going in consultancy fees and management fees to third-party suppliers. So we are heading rapidly towards a US-style healthcare system where everything has to be paid for, and primarily forcing people onto corporate payrolls so that they have health insurance. And if they choose to live outside of the corporatocracy, then they either pay outrageous sums for private healthcare insurance, or basically they get sick and die. So Jeremy Hunt, of course, working very closely with Common Purpose. And anyone who is not familiar with Common Purpose, this insidious organisation, this charity set up by Julia Middleton in 1988, and has worked with successive governments from both sides of the political spectrum to destroy what we have known for much of our lives as civil society in this country. And I would encourage you to do some research into Common Purpose. The health service, the police, local authorities have paid enormous sums of money to have their staff reframed through Common Purpose, behaviourally reframed, which is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to actually grasp what is occurring, because these people speak with conviction about what they're doing without any real realisation that they are participating in the systematic destruction of civil society in this country. And Jeremy Hunt, of course, also demanded that he be responsible for social care. Well, you know, this is a bit like putting Jimmy Savile in charge of kindergartens or morgues. You know, so we can see it. It's there for all to see. It really is no longer deniable that the basic social fabric of this country is being literally not just ripped apart, but shredded. And from an ecological standpoint, of course, Greg Clark is still on point. We know that Greg Clark is extremely reluctant because The kit at Kirby Misperton has now been sitting there for a little over 9 weeks without any apparent movement. It's going to be very interesting in subsequent weeks and months to establish exactly why there was this 9-week delay. Initially, of course, it was blamed on needing to close a loophole in the 2015 Infrastructure Act because it didn't actually cover fracks in wells, or potential fracks in wells that had been drilled before 2015. But, whatever the obfuscation about the delay, nonetheless, there's a 9-week delay, and it's also going to be interesting to find out who's paying for all the equipment and all the manpower that's effectively just been sitting around for 9 weeks. So Greg Clark has to make a decision, and that could be imminent or not, but it seems really unrealistic to expect him to delay that decision for too much longer. I mean, Barclays Bank, trading as Third Energy, must also be getting a little impatient, but it is a case of let's do it now, Greg, or determine why it shouldn't be done now. Well, there's a multitude of reasons why it shouldn't be done now, and there has been a plethora of information that has been sent to Greg Clark, so there is absolutely no excuse here, and Greg Clark knows fine well that it doesn't matter whether even the well at Kirby Misperton actually comes off without a hitch, because if that kicks off an industry which then subsequently establishes a footprint right across the whole of the north of England, at some point it's going to go belly up. And the name of Greg Clark will always be associated with signing off on that first well. And as Brian Monk says so often in Australia, this started with just one well. And now after 12 years, this is the 12th year now of unconventional gas exploitation in southern Queensland, and the devastation there is absolutely horrendous. And we just imagine that this area, this massive area right across the north of England, home to in excess of 20 million people, and the potential of those people for living in a gas field, the health risks, the risk of contamination, and of course the biggest issue is the contamination to farmland, because the farmland in this country is so crucial. We do not have food security. We import 50% of all food purchased in this country and consumed in this country, and so if we devastate large tracts of prime agricultural land right across the north of England, it's going to put even more pressure on that. But that's actually part of the plan. In case you hadn't gathered, part of the plan. And for those who are aware of the bigger picture, you will be familiar with the agenda to force people off the land and force people into smart cities. And I know some may go, oh, rampant conspiracy theory. Really? Well, really? Take a look at what is happening. Just take a look at the facts. How many young people are able to make a living and to live lives in the rural areas? It is increasingly difficult. They have to go into the cities to be able to earn a reasonable salary and to be able to afford accommodation. So we're seeing it happen. And of course, if the land is contaminated, then it's going to accelerate that process. Meanwhile, of course, INEOS, who actually, I think INEOS is actually misspelling. It should be INSOC, because it was INSOC, of course, that was the party that were in the fictional work of Eric Blair, George Orwell, in 1984. And as I've alluded to many times when I'm discussing deep geopolitics, I don't believe for one moment that Eric Blair was writing a work of fiction emanating from his imagination. It was effectively an effort to raise awareness of the risks of a right-wing, extreme right-wing, totalitarian government. And he was basing, I believe, his work on reading Technocracy Inc., a document that was published in 1932, written by Marion King Hubbard, who is also attributed with originating the hypothesis of peak oil, and his mentor, Howard Scott. And in 1932, Marion King Hubbard and Howard Scott had a vision, but they didn't have the technology with which to implement that vision. That technology now exists, basically. And I would implore people, if you haven't read 1984, to read it. It was written in 1948, published in early 1949. Shortly afterwards, Eric Blair died. Nothing conspiratorial about that at all. He had rampant tuberculosis, and although he got the best treatment available at the time, he eventually succumbed to the disease. But he was putting out a warning, just as he was with Animal Farm, which was the risk of a left-wing totalitarian state. Well, what effectively we have and is being driven by common purpose is effectively an amalgam. Some elements of extreme right-wing totalitarianism and some elements of the left-wing, the collectivism. However you want to, whatever label you want to put it, it is collectivism, where effectively every individual is literally just seen as a part of the state. And effectively, that's what you are, a human resource. I mean, you're effectively being told what you are. You are a human resource to be used, abused, and discarded on whim. And certainly if you're not able to make any contribution to the corporatocracy, then you might as well just slide off and die, because you're of no value to the collectivist state. And INSOC, or INEOS, of course, under Jim Ratcliffe, are behaving as though the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was actually in place, because they have now threatened to sue the Scottish government. And of course, had the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership actually managed to become established, it would have set a raft of legislation above EU and national legislation. And for those who aren't aware, you know, I need to point out, because somebody wanted to try and argue this with me a few days ago, the UK has been subordinate to EU legislation since 1972. The European Communities Act of 1972 subjugated the UK to the EU. And that was even obviously before the referendum in 75. And of course the British people were misled, openly misled, by Ted Heath about what membership of the what was then called the European Economic Community would actually bring about in the UK. So Brexit, will it happen? Well, that's another discussion. Of course, there are elements doing everything they possibly can to delay Brexit, and there are others doing everything they possibly can, like Jeremy Hunt, to destroy the social fabric of the UK so that the British people will be gagging to get back in at another referendum. But of course, at that point, it'll be a case of, okay, we can come back in, but you subjugate yourself in totality, so that the UK would literally be nothing more than a vassal state, absolute vassal state of the EU. So Jim Ratcliffe is looking to sue the Scottish government for denying him his lawful right to destroy the central belt of Scotland for his own personal benefit, because the only reason that INEOS are looking to mine the gas is so that he can reduce the costs of his feedstock for producing chemicals, fertilizers and plastics at his various plants around the world, and particularly in the UK. So of course, he's looking to increase his holding of licenses across the central belt of northern England as well, across the M62 corridor. He already has his hands on 1.2 million acres. But almost all of the other companies, and particularly iGas here at Misson, they are all hoping that Jim Ratcliffe and INEOS will buy them out just as soon as they've established the viability of the wells, the exploratory wells that they drill. They have no real viability long term. And, you know, my counsel to iGas investors is exactly the same as it was at the start of the Barton Moss campaign exactly 4 years ago. And that is, get out. Do not buy this stock. If you're holding it, sell it, because it is going to tank. The only reason it's holding at the moment is because of this mistaken perception that the price of oil and gas is going to ramp back up. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. OPEC are simply looking to try to maximize the last remaining years of the twilight years, effectively, of a hydrocarbon-driven economy. You know, they're looking to shut down, if they can, certainly the export of the shale hydrocarbons coming out of the US. They took it right down, of course, a couple of years ago to below $30 a barrel. It's now back in the 60s and pushing $70 a barrel. And, of course, the likes of Jim Ratcliffe and iGas and Quadrilla, Barclays Bank, trading as Third Energy, are all hoping that it goes back to well over $100 a barrel and they can make out like bandits. Well, that ain't going to happen. So it's enjoying a little bit of a rise right now. But as soon as OPEC sense that they're starting to lose market share, then the price will be dropped and the pressure will be back on those who want to exploit unconventional hydrocarbons in the UK. Well, of course, people at Kirby Misperton are sitting there on tenterhooks. Is Greg Clark going to sacrifice the village of Kirby Misperton and the villages of Great Habton, Little Bath, Great Bath? And, you know, is this going to be the trigger, the starting gun of unconventional gas exploitation across the north of England? Well, unfortunately, of course, the people of Kirby Misperton are hoping that that isn't the case. But right now, I'm not even going to suggest it's an even bet. One can only hope that Greg Clark does and has taken the time to read the plethora of information that's been forwarded to him, because once he has taken a look at that and he's discarded the counsel of those who have a vested interest in pushing ahead, then he will do the right thing and shut it down. And that, of course, will be massive. Meanwhile, here at Misson Springs, we're at the front end of starting the Misson Springs Protection Camp here. Pad construction has started. It's about half a mile up the road from here, and pad construction has started at Tinker Lane, about 7-8 miles to the southwest of here. And then, of course, INEOS looking to establish well sites at Woodsets and Eckington and it's Marsh Lane, Woodsets, and one other which escapes me just for a second. But anyway, so we're looking at trying to make sure that the people of Nottinghamshire, North Derbyshire and South Yorkshire have all the support they can get to raise awareness and ultimately to shut down this industry. So this is now 5 years. It's exactly 5 years ago when I was just putting the final touches to the Fractured Future Tour, which kicked off in early February of 2013. You know, we've come a long way since then. Of course, we still don't have a frack. So when people say, but what can you do? What can you do? They're doing it anyway. No, they're not. No, they're not. You know, the UK anti-fracking community has grown exponentially. And although in England we haven't had the success of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, then the reality is that they're definitely on the back foot. So thanks very much for joining me this morning. It looks like we've got our first visitors arriving here at the Misson Springs Protection Camp. And as is always the case, the initial costs of setting up a camp are not inconsiderable, and we have some support from the local community here. But if you feel that you would like to make a contribution to setting up the camp, please go to frackingnightmare.com, and you'll see the donation button up on the top left-hand side to the fracking awareness campaign. And any funds donated will be going directly right now to establishing the Missing Springs Protection Camp. Meanwhile, if you're in the area, please do come and visit. And of course, Preston New Road needs support, where Quadrilla are now in the 13th month of a 6-month project. And of course, at Kirby Misperton, if Greg Clark does sign off on the application to frack, then we need as many people at Kirby Misperton as is possible to witness this horrendous but very significant event. Well, thanks for joining me this morning. Hopefully tomorrow morning the weather won't be quite so miserable, and I'll be able to get back outside and hopefully be at the gates of Missing Springs Wellsite, the Rocket Gate here on Springs Road in North Nottinghamshire. And please, come down and join us and, see what's occurring. Meanwhile, have a great day. We've got a day of construction ahead of us, and we'll catch with you tomorrow. Thanks a lot.